There are names that the ocean never forgets, names that carry a chill, even in the warmest currents. But one name stands above them all: the Mary Celeste. For over a century, she has been the ultimate ghost ship, a vessel of shadows, sailing through the fog of time, carrying 10 souls who vanished into thin air. 2026 Archive Retrieval. Location: the Mid-Atlantic. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste set sail from New York with 701 barrels of industrial alcohol. 1 month later, she was found drifting near the Azores. The sails were set. The cargo was intact. Legend says the captain's tea was still warm on the table, and the half-eaten meals of the crew were left undisturbed. But not a single soul was on board. For 150 years, we've been told stories of ghost pirates, sea monsters, and cursed waters. But as we reopen the declassified files in 2026, the data points to something far more disturbing than any myth. Why did Captain Briggs, a veteran of the sea, abandon his ship in calm weather? Why were exactly 9 barrels of alcohol found empty, yet completely undamaged? And what was discussed during the final dinner at Astor House, just days before the disappearance? Today, we peel back the layers of Victorian folklore to reveal the forensic reality of the world's most famous ghost ship. This is not just a ghost story. This is a synchronization of tragedy, physics, and a fear that still haunts the deep. Before we dive into the deep-sea frequency of the Mary Celeste, make sure to subscribe and activate your archive access. This is the first chapter of our Ghost Ship series. The truth has been drifting for too long. Let us begin the investigation. Before she was the Mary Celeste, she was known as the Amazon. Built in 1861 at Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, this 282-ton brigantine was never meant to be a ghost ship. But from the moment her keel touched the water, misfortune followed. Her first captain, Robert McClellan, died unexpectedly just 9 days after taking command. During her first major voyage, she collided with fishing equipment in the narrowest straits. Later, while crossing the English Channel, she ran into another ship, sending it to the bottom of the sea. In 1867, the Amazon ran aground during a storm at Glace Bay. She was so badly damaged that her owners abandoned her as a total wreck, but the ship refused to die. She was salvaged, repaired, and re-registered under American ownership. In 1868, she was given a new name. A name that would become synonymous with the unexplained: the Mary Celeste. By the time Benjamin Briggs bought a share in the vessel in 1872, the ship had been heavily modified. Her hull was reinforced, and her cargo hold was deepened to carry one of the most dangerous materials of the era: denatured industrial alcohol. Briggs spent a fortune, nearly $10,000, to prepare her for the voyage to Genoa. He brought his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, on board. To him, this ship was not a cursed vessel. It was his family's future. But as the 701 barrels of alcohol were lowered into the hold, the ship's past seemed to linger in the damp wood. The Mary Celeste was now a floating powder keg, carrying a cargo that was volatile, invisible, and silent. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor. The weather was fair, and the crew was experienced. For the first 2 weeks, the voyage was uneventful. According to the recovered logbook, Captain Briggs maintained a rigorous daily record. By November 24th, they had reached the Azores. The winds were picking up, and the sea was becoming restless. The last entry in the logbook is dated November 25th at 8 a.m. It marks their position as 6 miles north-northeast of Santa Maria Island. The note is professional and calm. There is no mention of storms, no mention of panic, and certainly no mention of abandoning ship. Then, the silence began. For the next 10 days, the Mary Celeste was a ghost, sailing without a soul to guide her. She covered nearly 600 miles of open ocean on her own, maintaining a steady course toward the Strait of Gibraltar. On December 5th, the Dei Gratia, commanded by Captain Morehouse, spotted a speck on the horizon. As they drew closer, they realized it was the Mary Celeste. But something was wrong. Her sails were torn, flapping loosely in the wind. She was yawing, drifting aimlessly, as if blind. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia stepped onto the deck, they expected to find a scene of struggle or a crew stricken by plague. Instead, they found a vacuum. The ship was in remarkably good condition. The galley was clean. In the cabin, Captain Briggs's personal belongings, including his sword, remained in their places. In the child's room, toys were scattered on the floor as if Sophia had just been playing with them. But the clues to their departure were disturbing. The only lifeboat was missing. The main halyard, the heavy rope used to pull the sails, was broken and trailing in the water. And most mysteriously, the ship's daily log and navigational instruments were gone. Whoever left this ship did so in a state of extreme urgency. They didn't even stop to take their clothes or their money. They simply stepped off into the Atlantic, leaving the Mary Celeste to finish the journey alone. When the men from the Dei Gratia stepped onto the deck of the Mary Celeste, they didn't find a wreck. They found a series of chilling contradictions. The first thing that hit them was the silence. The ship was sailing on a slightly erratic path, yet everything on deck suggested a sudden, frantic departure. One of the most unsettling sights was the ship's pump. One had been disassembled and the other was still functional, but beside it lay a makeshift-sounding rod, a piece of wood used to measure the depth of water in the hull. It had been left carelessly on the deck. Below deck, the contradictions grew deeper. In the captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs's sewing machine sat on the table with a half-finished garment. Her husband's watch hung on a nail, still ticking. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No violence. It looked as if 10 people had simply blinked out of existence. But here is the mystery. The ship's log, the official document that recorded their daily navigation and speed, was missing. So how do we know what happened during those final days? The answer lies in a rough slate, a chalkboard, found in the captain's cabin. On this slate, Captain Briggs had scribbled his final observations before transferring them to the official logbook. This log slate survived. It provided the final timestamp, November 25th, 8 a.m. Beyond that slate, the only other evidence came from the manifest and the business papers found in the captain's desk. These documents proved that the cargo 701 barrels of alcohol was the ship's primary reason for being. When the investigators finally opened the hatch to the cargo hold, they were met with a powerful, choking fume of alcohol. It was here that they made a discovery that would change the investigation forever. While the barrels looked perfect from the outside, 9 of them were empty. Not leaked, not broken. Just empty. As the Dei Gratia towed the silent Mary Celeste toward Gibraltar, the mystery only deepened. The absence of the official logbook suggested that Captain Briggs had time to grab his most important papers, but not enough time to save his family's life. Besides Captain Briggs, his wife, and their daughter, there were 7 other souls on the Mary Celeste. These were not random sailors. They were a hand-picked crew of professional mariners, including 2 experienced German brothers, the Volkerts. These were men who had survived countless storms. They knew how to handle a ship in crisis. Yet, they all vanished alongside the captain. When the rescuers searched the crew's quarters, the vibe was even more disturbing than the captain's cabin. They found the sailors, pipes, still packed with tobacco, laying on their bunks. In the 19th century, a sailor's pipe was his most prized possession. To leave it behind was unthinkable, unless you believed death was coming in seconds. Even more bizarre, their oilskins and heavy sea boots were still in their lockers. It was November in the Atlantic. The weather was cold, and the spray was freezing. To jump into a small lifeboat in the middle of the ocean, without your waterproof gear, was a death sentence. So what exactly was missing besides the logbook and the navigation tools? First, the ship's register, the legal ID of the vessel. Second, the captain's chronometer, an incredibly expensive and delicate instrument used to determine longitude. And third, the main halyard, the massive rope used to raise the mainsail. The rope hadn't been neatly untied. It had been broken or cut, trailing behind the ship like a severed umbilical cord. This leads to a haunting realization. Captain Briggs took the tools needed to find his way home, but he left behind the clothes needed to stay alive. It was a departure driven by a logic we still don't understand. A fear so intense that the freezing Atlantic seemed safer than the dry deck of the Mary Celeste. When Captain Morehouse towed the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar on December 13, 1872, he expected a hero's welcome and a massive salvage reward. Instead, he walked into a legal trap. The Attorney General of Gibraltar, Solly Flood, was a man who hated mysteries. To him, the empty deck of the Mary Celeste didn't suggest a supernatural event, was suggested a perfect crime. Flood ordered a forensic inspection of the ship that lasted for months. They were looking for blood. They found a few dark stains on the deck and a small notch in the ship's railing that looked like it could have been made by an axe. Flood's theory was simple. The crew of the Dei Gratia had murdered everyone on the Mary Celeste, thrown the bodies overboard, and then staged the finding of the ghost ship to collect the insurance money. But science in 1873 was beginning to fight back. A chemical analysis of the stains proved they weren't blood at all. They were rust, and old iron rust mixed with salt water. The axe marks were found to be nothing more than natural wear and tear on the wood. The investigation reached a total stalemate. There were no bodies, no struggle, and no motive for Captain Briggs to kill his own family. It was during this deadlock that the investigators turned their attention to the only thing that had changed on the ship, the cargo. When they recounted the 1,701 barrels of alcohol, the numbers didn't lie. 9 barrels were empty. And these 9 barrels were made of red oak, a more porous wood than the white oak used for the rest of the shipment. Could 9 empty barrels explain the disappearance of 10 people? The court was forced to release the ship and pay Morehouse his reward, but it was a fraction of what he expected. The judge's final verdict was chilling in its lack of answers. He stated that the cause of the abandonment remained a mystery that no human eye had witnessed. The Mary Celeste was free to sail again, but she was now branded. She was a ship that had swallowed its crew and offered no explanation in return. The most disturbing part of the Mary Celeste file is the fate of Captain Benjamin Briggs. He didn't just disappear. He took his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, with him into the dark Atlantic. In 1873, the investigators in Gibraltar kept asking one question: why? Briggs was a partial owner of the ship. He had invested his life savings into this voyage. He was an expert navigator. If he chose to leave the safety of a solid, floating vessel to get into a tiny, overcrowded lifeboat, he must have believed that the Mary Celeste was seconds away from a catastrophe. But when the Dei Gratia found the ship, there was no fire. There was no explosion. The ship was perfectly buoyant. This led to 2 dark theories during the inquiry. First, the murder theory. Could the crew have mutinied, killed the Briggs family, and escaped? But there was no sign of a struggle, and the captain's pistol was still in its drawer, unfired. Plus, these sailors were hand-picked for their loyalty. Second, the insurance fraud. Could Briggs and Morehouse have planned this together? But this theory falls apart when you look at the facts. Briggs loved his son, Arthur, who had stayed behind in New York for school. Why would a loving father abandon his son and vanish forever, just for a share of insurance money? As the months passed, it became clear that Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew were not coming back. No bodies ever washed ashore. No debris from the lifeboat was ever found. They had vanished into a blind spot of history. The man who was responsible for the safety of everyone on board had led them directly into the void, leaving behind a perfectly functional ship as a silent monument to their final, panicked moments. The investigation in Gibraltar found one physical anomaly that could explain everything: the 9 empty barrels of alcohol. These barrels were made of red oak, which is more porous than white oak. In the heat of the Atlantic, the industrial alcohol began to vaporize, leaking through the wood. In 2026, we can simulate the atmosphere inside that cargo hold. The fumes would have been invisible, but the smell would have been overwhelming and toxic. On November 25th, Captain Briggs likely ordered the hatch to be opened to ventilate the ship. When the fresh air hit the concentrated alcohol vapors, it didn't cause a massive fire, but it could have caused a series of small, terrifying blow-offs. Localized pressure explosions that sounded like the ship was tearing itself apart. Briggs, fearing an imminent massive explosion that would blow the Mary Celeste to pieces, made a split-second decision. He didn't intend to abandon the ship forever. He ordered everyone into the small lifeboat, attached to the Mary Celeste by that long, heavy rope, the main halyard. His plan was to trail behind the ship at a safe distance until the vapors cleared. But then, the physics of the ocean took over. A sudden change in wind or a rogue wave likely snapped the rope. Because the Mary Celeste had its sails set, she caught the wind and began to pull away. In a small, overloaded lifeboat, the crew would have watched in horror as their only home sailed away into the mist, leaving them stranded in the middle of the Atlantic with no supplies and no hope of rescue. This explains why the ship was found in perfect condition, because the explosion Briggs feared never actually happened. To understand why the court suspected a conspiracy, we must look at the bond between two men, Benjamin Briggs and David Morehouse. These weren't just two random captains. They were veteran mariners who had known each other for years, sharing the same social circles in the tight-knit shipping community of New England. On November 4, 1872, just days before the Mary Celeste was to sail, the two friends met at the Astor House Hotel in New York for dinner. Imagine the scene: the clinking of glasses, the smell of cigar smoke, and two captains discussing their upcoming voyages across the Atlantic. Briggs was anxious. This was his first time transporting industrial alcohol. Morehouse, an experienced hand, was scheduled to depart on the Dei Gratia just 8 days later, following almost the exact same route to the Mediterranean. This brings us to the most controversial question in maritime history. Did they plan to meet at sea? In 1872, the ocean was a wilderness, with no GPS and no radio. Finding a specific ship in the middle of the Atlantic was like finding a needle in a haystack. Yet on December 5th, Morehouse's ship managed to intercept the Mary Celeste at the perfect moment. To the Gibraltar investigators, this wasn't luck. They believed the two captains had made a pact during that dinner at Astor House. The theory was that Briggs would abandon his ship at a prearranged coordinate. Morehouse would then discover it, tow it to port, and they would split the massive salvage prize, a fortune that would allow both men to retire. It was a perfect plan on paper, but there is one fatal flaw that destroys this theory: Sarah and Sophia Briggs. Benjamin Briggs was a man of high moral character. If this was a financial scam, he would never have risked the lives of his wife and 2-year-old daughter in a tiny lifeboat in the middle of the winter Atlantic. If they had a pact to meet, something went horribly wrong before the Dei Gratia arrived. A dinner between friends turned into a race against a phantom, and by the time Morehouse reached the coordinates, the man he had dined with in New York was already gone. Let's be honest. The scientific explanation, the alcohol vapor theory, feels incomplete. If there was a threat of explosion, why were the hatches found closed and secured? Why wasn't the ship scorched? A veteran captain like Briggs would know that a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic is a much more certain death than staying on a solid ship that hasn't exploded yet. And the insurance fraud theory? It's even more fragile. Benjamin Briggs was a man who lived by the Bible. He didn't just love his family. He was obsessed with their safety. He brought them on board because he believed the Mary Celeste was the safest place for them. To suggest he would force his wife and baby into a tiny boat as part of a money-making scheme contradicts everything we know about the man. So we are left with a terrifying third option. Something happened on that ship that was so sudden and so unnatural that it bypassed logic. Was it a seaquake, a rare underwater earthquake that caused the seafloor to release massive bubbles of methane gas, making the ship feel like it was sinking in an instant? Or was it something the 2026 data is only now beginning to hint at? There are certain frequencies in the ocean, low-frequency sound waves caused by deep-sea currents hitting underwater mountains. These frequencies, known as infrasound, are silent to the human ear, but they trigger a primitive, uncontrollable biological response. Absolute paralyzing panic. Infrasound can cause hallucinations, extreme nausea, and an overwhelming urge to flee your current environment at any cost. Did the Mary Celeste sail into a pocket of localized madness? Did the captain and crew look at each other and, without a word, decide they had to leave the ship? Not because of fire, but because the very air on deck had become a weapon of psychological terror? They didn't leave the ship because it was sinking. They left because they could no longer bear to be on it. After 3 months of grueling investigation, the Gibraltar court reached a conclusion that satisfied no one. The Attorney General, Solly Flood, failed to find a single drop of blood or any evidence of a struggle. He had no choice but to release the Dei Gratia and its crew. However, the shadow of suspicion remained. The court awarded Morehouse and his crew £700 in salvage money. It sounds like a large sum, but it was only 1/6 of the ship's total value. The judge deliberately kept the reward low, a silent signal that the court still suspected foul play, but couldn't prove it. Morehouse returned to the sea, but he was a changed man. The shipping world is small, and rumors travel faster than the wind. For the rest of his life, he was haunted by whispers. People looked at him, not as the hero who saved a ghost ship, but as the man who might have murdered his best friend for a pile of gold. He never spoke publicly about that night in the Astor House, or what his crew really saw on the deck of the Mary Celeste. He died in 1891, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. As for the Mary Celeste herself, she became a pariah of the ocean. Sailors believed she was cursed. Over the next 12 years, she changed hands 17 times, each owner suffering from bankruptcies, accidents, or mysterious deaths. Her story ended in 1885, when her final captain deliberately ran her onto a coral reef near Haiti in a desperate attempt at insurance fraud. Even in her final moments, the Mary Celeste was a vessel of deceit and tragedy. The sea finally took her, but the file remains open. 10 people walked off a perfectly good ship into a void, leaving behind a mystery that proves sometimes the truth is not just stranger than fiction. It is more terrifying. The Mary Celeste was finally sold for scrap, her timber rotting on a distant reef in Haiti, but the mystery she carried did not die with her. To this day, maritime historians and scientists argue over the why. Was it the 9 empty barrels of alcohol? Was it a freak earthquake from the ocean floor? Or was it a psychological breakdown triggered by the very frequencies of the deep? We may never have a definitive answer. What we do have is a warning. The Mary Celeste reminds us that the ocean is not a highway. It is an alien world, and sometimes, even the most experienced, rational men can be driven to a choice that defies everything we know about human survival. Captain Benjamin Briggs took his secrets into the cold Atlantic. Captain David Morehouse carried his secrets to a lonely grave. The rest is just static in the archive. But our investigation into the shadow protocols of the sea is far from over. If the story of the Mary Celeste shows us what happens when people flee a ship, our next case shows us the horror of what happens when they cannot. In our next file, we travel to 1926. A Japanese fishing vessel, the Ryoe Maru, is found drifting off the coast of California. On board, there are no missing souls, only a diary of a slow, cannibalistic descent into madness that lasted for 300 days. Don't miss the next frequency. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to gain full access to the Whispers Beyond archives. Thank you for listening to The Silence. Archive Log, 1872. Status: unresolved. End of transmission.